What is up, my people? My name's Anton and welcome back to September. Today we're going to be taking a little look at creating these pillows inside of Cinema 4D and Redshift. Again, a pretty simple setup, but we're going to take a look at a few techniques, namely some cloth modeling and a little bit of lighting, which you can use to create a result which looks just like this. So I'm aware of a lot of you guys aren't beginners. I've got a pretty good variety of viewers, but just in case you are, I figured I'd do something a little different this time. And what I'm going to try and do is break down the process that I'm actually going to make this outside of C4D first, so you understand the steps and how we can actually go about creating a result which looks a little like this. So I've got my iPad set up here, and I'm going to explain how we're going to actually create these pillows and then simulate and render them to create a pretty simple looping result which looks something like this. So first off, what we're going to do is actually create a cube. So this all starts with a cube, right? So I'm just going to sketch that out here super quick. And what we're going to do with this is it will be a pretty default cube, but it's important because we're simulating that we need to bear in mind the geometry in situations like this. Geometry is pretty much responsible at this point, segments in particular, for how fast or slow that simulation is going to run. And also it changes how the simulation behaves. If you change the segments after you've applied a cloth tag or a soft body, you're going to pretty much see different results. Although minor, it almost has as much of an effect as a lot of the parameters that you actually change inside the tag. So we're starting off with a cube here, and we've got to bear in mind only this plane here really in terms of the segments. So by default, it'll probably be 1, but we need to change this so that it is looking a little something like this. Obviously, I'm on an iPad, so bear in mind that it's not going to be as messy as this, and obviously probably a few more, but we're going to look at getting a grid a little like that. And that's pretty much where our segments are going to lie. What we're going to use is a cloth tag with the Dress-O-Matic tool to select the loop, use the loop select tool to basically grab these edge pieces, these edge sides just here and here, and then collapse them and create them as seams. And what that's going to do is take the geometry that we've created up here, so those segments, and it's going to pull them together from the bottom and the top to create the seams that you kind of see on the pillow. And the reason those segments are important is not only for the simulation, but also that should technically create some little like ridges or sort of like stretch marks in the pillow, which are responsible for making it look obviously less soft and like candy and more like an actual pillow. And then at that point, once we're ready with all that, what we'll be able to do is simulate that. So we're going to take our pillow which we've created. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but a little something like this, of course, with some ridges around the sides. And we're going to basically be creating pretty similar to a lot of the other like force tutorials I've done in the past, but we're going to be adding a spherical field right in the center with a part right in the middle which isn't actually affected by the attractor. So this is just be an attractor force. This will of course be pulling those pillows into the center, and our camera will be honing right in on this point here. What that means is you'll have the pillows obviously flying about here, sort of swirling about with the turbulence effector too, and you'll get a quick little camera angle here of how they collide and how they look cool. But meanwhile, this force is obviously bringing them in, so they're not escaping, and what you get is this pretty cool effect that you can sort of manipulate to what you want to do. And then we can obviously light and render it how we want to. You can see on the example, we've got some gobos there, so we've got some sort of like light flowing through the windows, and that's why we'll just set up a little light, shine it down. We're using a spotlight in Redshift, and that'll create a pretty cool look for what we're after. So without any further ado, we'll hop straight into C4D. Beautiful. So we're inside C4D here, and we're going to get started with what I was just explaining. So we're going to get started with a cube. Quick side point, but we're working in Cinema 4D 2023, which is the version after R26. The reason for that is because there's a new soft body deformer which we're going to be using. This wasn't actually my choice. I was working in R26 and the soft body just didn't work, or rather it was really, really slow. So I gave this a try to see if it would be any quicker, and it worked out being a little quicker. So although a lot of the settings should be the same and the result on your machine may be different, so don't take it too tightly. Of course, the soft body has a few different functions and it may look a little different, but the actual principle should be the same, so don't worry about it too much. But without dragging on, we can take a look at our lines here, and we can see we've got nowhere near the topology that we need on the top. So we can work with our segments X and segments Y real quick, or rather Z and X, to kind of create what we want. So I'm thinking of going with about probably 50-50. Like I said, there's two reasons for this. So number one is obviously the detail in the simulation, and secondly, the segments here are going to be responsible for creating those creases in the pillow, right? So the more you have, obviously the more detailed it will be, but obviously the slower your simulation will be. There's a midpoint, but it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So this is pretty dense here. I'd be inclined to say this may be a little too dense. But what I'm hoping we'll be able to do is use the remesh tool later on. So for now, we can hit C on our keyboard to bake this off and give this a quick shot. What we need to make sure we do now is right click and add ourselves a quick cloth tag. Now we're not actually using this for the final simulation, but what this has is this dresser function here. What this allows us to do is basically create those seams. So if we now head to select up here, or rather get into face mode and then hit select, and I used the loop selection to just pick out these functions here. So if I click off and then click that, you can see it just selects them like that. Then we can head into our cloth function here, and you need to create seam polys. Click set, and that's going to create these yellow lines here, and then you can change the steps and width depending on what you need. Typically the steps basically relates to how much detail actually goes into that simulation. It doesn't really change how it looks. It does change how it looks, but it changes how long it'll actually simulate for. You'll see what I mean in a sec. I think in the last example I used about quite a lot, 5,000 to 500 to 1,000. So let's try 500 for now. What we'll do is then click Dress-O-Matic, and you'll see that it should drag these seams together. So if we wait for this to load, you'll see this is where, and then you'll see what your pillow actually looks like. So you can see what I mean about the creases here, and you can also see what I mean about the segments. It takes a little while, by the way, when you see your cursor's kind of going, you're just loading. Just let it do its thing. The bigger your steps are, the longer that's going to take. So just bear that in mind. And you also want to think about your width here. So your width is going to basically be how plumped that pillow is, but it also relates to the creases. So again, it's sort of a delicate dance. Just bear it in mind. If you're happy with this, that's great. But for me, I think it's a little thick. So I'm going to turn this down a little bit. It's pretty easy to just Control Z. What we're going to do is just grab all of the faces here and just scale them down a tad. Maybe even something like this. You can see your old polygons there, not a problem. And then what we can do is again head to select, loop selection, grab this, hop back into our set seam polys and then Dress-O-Matic, let it do its 500 steps. I think that's kind of the sweet spot for this. I used way higher in the example, but I think this works pretty well. And then what we can do is click off. That was a little thick, hold on. Then we need to set initial state, or rather, nah. Hold on. Back to this, and then make sure we're selecting the seam polys just one more time. I think that works well. Dress-O-Matic, and there we go. We can see it's a little less thick, but the creases sort of aren't the same extent. But then the steps being at 500 sort of seems to help a little bit. I'm in two minds whether to make this a little thicker again and try extract as much of those seams as I can, or sort of just leave it like this. But you know what? For now, I think we'll leave it at this. You can also change your width. Let's see what happens if we change that to 5 centimeters. You know what? We'll leave it like this. I think this is a pretty good result. Now, this is something that I remember from my previous session, in that it actually is quite difficult to bake this. I was messing with something just now where I think I clicked initial state, set initial state, and it seemed to get rid of the Dress-O-Matic, and I could also scroll through the viewport. But if I right click, you see it kind of just sets it back, and you might have this issue too, so you're not alone. I think even if I click to right click and then connect objects and delete, it still had the cloth tag here, but okay, no, that seemed to work. In the last example, I actually had to bake as a limbic, which was a quick little workaround. But if you do that, if you click set initial state and then it'll create this and you just delete that cloth tag, you'll have a pillow here that's ready to go. So now you can see this is pretty much what we're using for our simulation. I'm actually pretty happy with this because the topology isn't too bad. So we may actually be able to simulate this, The only thing I say is obviously these ridges aren't as, you know, smooth as I'd like. We can drop it into a subdivision surface and you can kind of see that it improves it. So if anything, I think it's there, which is the most important thing. But this is what we're going to be working with. We do not want this inside of a subdivision surface yet, because that will slow the simulation right down. So for now, what we can do is start setting that up a little bit. So what we want to do is basically create a cloner. So if we just grab ourselves a cloner and drag this in, what we'll be able to do is set this to radial, and then we can set this to whatever axis you want, but I use something a little like this. You want to have the radius set to probably something quite high, I'd say maybe like 1,000. And then what we want to do is basically, this is what I was on about visualizing. So we're going to have a force, which is bringing them into the middle and making them collide. Obviously later on, what we're going to have to do, the reason we have this cloner here is so we can add some random effectors and stuff, so they're not all falling in at the same time. But what you'll see is that's pretty much what we're after. Going to save this up here, and we can do is for now. Let's try recreate what I'm talking about with the simulation. So let's hit simulate here. Let's get forces, attractor. What we have to do is right click on the cloner here and then head to simulation. And this is the new soft body tag, which is in 2023. If you don't see this here, it'll be in bullet tags in this bit here. There's a soft body tag there too. But we're going to give this a shot just because it seems to be a little smoother last time. And what we can do is now get our attractor. We can up the strength something like 500, just so we're seeing it, setting it to force, heading into fields and just grabbing ourselves a quick spherical field. And if we scale this up, this is actually working the opposite way right now. So we head to remap in, we can see that as soon as the pillows come into here, it's going to bring them into the middle, and it's basically going to make them glitch out and explode in the middle because there's no endpoint. That's not what we want. What we want is to actually tick the invert button here, and that's going to change. You can kind of see it represented on the graph here, but it's going to bring them in, and this sort of sphere you see in the middle is typically where they're going to be free to sort of move about and collide. We actually haven't activated this yet because we need to head to our forces tab and set the mode to include and drop that attractor in. And then if we just increase the length of our timeline, we should be able to play. And we're seeing a little bit of gravity right now, so make sure you're heading to project simulation and just turning the gravity off just there. If you're rendering with Redshift, another interesting point is make sure you're switching this from GPU to CPU, otherwise your VRAM will be completely full up. And if we play this, we can see we're getting some slight movement, but nowhere near strong enough. So let's see if turning this up to about 5,000 works. If not, it may be a case where it's the size of the spherical field, but this seems to work all right. So what we're getting, you can see, is these pillars moving into the middle here, and then stopping right about here. So this isn't ideal because obviously we've got 5,000 force on that, so it's pretty strong, and they're just sort of hovering in this middle bit. Ideally, what we want to do is, we have two options here. We can either, of course, turn that up something ridiculous. What might work a little better is actually just turning down the size of this spherical field a little bit. And this should affect them in the same way, so they're pretty affected out here, and have them fall into the middle here, and then collide like we want them to. But like we see, they're far too uniform right now. It's not what we want. So we're working with quite high force, which means that these are going to be brought in at a pretty high velocity anyway. What we can do to fix that is head into our cloner, grab ourselves a MoGraph effector and a random tag, and that's of course going to randomize it. And we can quickly tick the rotation and just put in any values, really doesn't matter too much. We're just trying to get a random starting point. And then we can also use the position tag. So we can move this around kind of wherever we want. It's going to make it look a little more like it's in 3D space rather than a starfish. And we can now tweak some of these values. So the main one that I was kind of on about is you want something which is going to change how far each of these pillows are out. So that seems to be this one. So we can set this to something like -1,000. And what it's going to do is make it so these pillows here sort of come in first, and that was going to fly, and that one and that one. And if we play, you sort of see what I mean. We're working from quite far here. This one might come in a little later because it might be too far out. What you'll see is they'll sort of move in sequence, and that one will come in. But I'm almost inclined to turn this down a little bit, purely so you know, they're not too far, and it almost gets to a point where some of them are out of reach. So tweak this to whatever you like. But now we have these ones coming in, a few of these, bosh bosh. And what you have are these pillows that are colliding. So it looks pretty good at the minute, but it looks a little boring. So let's take a look here. I actually think that works pretty well. If you want to add the complexity, of course, you can literally pre-procedurally head into the cloner here and just turn up the count. So if you wanted 10, you can do 10. It goes without saying it's going to slow down your simulation a little bit. But you will have 10 pillows that are colliding. And the great part about this is that when they bounce, they're just going to head back into the spherical field and go again to be collided. So you end up with a pretty cool loop. It also lets you pick out any part of your timeline that sort of looks good. If you have some dodgy frames where the pillows are sort of flying about looking a little weird, you can do that. And ultimately you're getting something which looks a little like this. So we're working with a good starting point, you can see here. But we want to create a little bit more movement. You can see they kind of just get brought into this orbit and kind of staying here. So let's make this a little more interesting. What we can do is get ourselves a turbulence field. And what that's going to do is going to add to the attractor and add a little bit of movement. Again, this is just a case of tweaking. Most of the rotation actually comes from their collision, so it's not going to rotate them too much, but it's going to move them around to add a little bit of something, I guess. So we can add forces here. Drop in the turbulence, it's all set to include. We can turn the strength up something maybe like 50, scale 500. I'm pretty sure you can leave it on acceleration. And this is where it's trial and error, so you can sort of see what this looks like. I was lucky because before my simulations were not running this quick. And you can see we're getting a nice little bit of movement. You want to bear in mind that for some of these, it's almost moving them out way too far. So what we can do is create a field again. We can move that into something like this so that that spherical field is only working there. And let's give that a play. Again, you can see how useful fields are, of course, because it quite literally lets you pick out exactly where you want certain, velocities to actually act, get involved. So we can now chase into the middle. See, we're getting it quite strong there, but it is working pretty well in creating what we want. We just want to make sure that the pillows aren't actually escaping. That should almost be our top priority here. This seems to be dragging around a little too much, so I'm inclined to turn this down to maybe something like 20. Also, the scale is pretty high, so you can either keep the strength a little higher and turn the scale down, or you can do this. I'm going to try both for a sec. Let's just see the kind of result that we get. And with a little bit of tweaking, you should get something that you're pretty happy with. At this point, it's all down to personal preference and art direction and stuff. But let's take a look. We're getting something pretty nice, I think. So getting these moving, getting some nice collisions. That's what I always look for. I look for the collisions that look cool. What I don't like is how that pillow sort of just like floats down. It doesn't look too interesting at all. So maybe let's up this to 50. You can also add another turbulence field if you like, and you can have sort of like both of them working together. In this case, let's just take a look at what this looks like. What that means is you can sort of have the bigger ones which sort of wave them around in unison, and you've got little ones that sort of tinker with maybe how the pillows themselves sort of work. But again, if you have the frequency high, it'll kind of look like they're jittering, and there's maybe a look that you want to avoid. But in general, these look pretty cool. These are floating about quite a bit here. But what we can then do is potentially turn up the force of the attractor a little bit. I think that's actually a little bit too high. I think 50... I think it works better when they were about 20. Let's just turn that down. And we're not able to score 3 yet because we haven't cached, but I'm going to give this one go. If this doesn't work, then we're going to, or isn't good enough, we're going to maybe create another turbulence or increase the force, and then move on to the next step. But once you're done with this, you're basically ready to cache. So again, if you're following this through, you're going to be doing this by yourself. So of course you can kind of skip through this bit, see the next step. But having said that, I think we're creating a pretty cool result here. So I'm going to leave it at this point. If you're sick of seeing it in like 10 FPS, you can head to your cloner here, your cache. We actually haven't had to change too much of the soft body settings here. That's worth mentioning. But I'm going to quickly try and run through what I can remember of what a lot of these do. By default, if you're using the same tag I'm using, a lot of these should work quite well. Something that I did remember that's worth mentioning is because of the nature of this geometry, you're much better leaving bendiness, stretchiness, and bounciness pretty low. I remember I had bounciness set at 2, and what you get is this weird sort of like noise displacement on this geometry, which looks really weird. So I sort of recommend keeping it off. It means it almost looks like just kind of like strange. I'll see if I can show you what I mean. But I think it's either, if I move this to something like 5, you'll see that it looks cool, but you get this floppiness on the edges too, which kind of looks alright. It adds a little bit of movement, but it depends what you're after. It doesn't look too pillowy, right? So bear in mind, but you may see what I mean. You get that sort of wiggle, which looks cool enough and adds a little bounciness to the simulation, but it's mainly the bendiness and stretchiness which really change how the geometry is sort of structured. But we'll leave it at that for now. It adds a nice little bit of velocity to the edges and makes it look a little less like concrete, so let's leave it at that. If you're having issues, the target length is pretty much like the density almost, but you want to keep that at 100%. You want to keep trim it over time, if anything, because if you do it at the start, it's just going to shrink into nothing. It's not going to look too good. We don't need to use balloon in this instance, and a lot of the stuff that's going to have an effect is going to be in this soft body bit here. So you can change the softness. I didn't find it had too much effect on this simulation, but the higher that softness is, goes without saying, but it's kind of like the softer those pillows look. I didn't find it. The only difference I saw was when I turned it to 0. So you don't need to bear that in mind too much this time. This create section here seems to have an effect with the poles per point, but it sort of refers to how this soft body is actually operating. So if you take a little look at what we're seeing here, we're seeing it being drawn when it's selected, and this is how soft bodies are actually working in C4D. So this is kind of a rabbit hole, but it's basically creating these spring attachments in between each like vertex of the geometry, and that's how it's calculating it. If you want it to look a little softer, or you're really having trouble, up the softness and up the max poles per point, it may well have an effect. For me, it didn't, but that's just a tidy run through of what you're going to see. It may well have more of a place in future tutorials, so keep an eye out. But for now, what we can head off and do is cache this. So we can just click cache scene, and we'll actually be able to play this through in full time. And again, see if you want any more changes or move forward. So we're done with that cache, and now if we play through, we can see that we're getting our pillows colliding pretty much just like we want, and I'm actually really happy with this. So we're going to move forward. Again, you can kind of see if you want to up these or do whatever you like. You can add some more random effects, just change a little bit of size variation, but for now I think these work pretty well for the tutorial that I'm after. So what we can do is, this is now cached, so we can group these just effectors off. And now this, in general, should be able to play however we ask it to. And you've got these pillows colliding here, which looks really cool. Now we're going to go straight into the rendering process pretty much. We're going to kind of structure the scene, but there's not too much to structure. We're going to go into obviously loading up Redshift and applying a few materials. And then you're pretty much good to render off. I think the version that I did, I picked apart from about 175 to 300, just so I didn't like how they were all coming in the middle. So I kind of like segmented this bit where a lot of collisions were happening, a lot of movement, and it sort of looked a little better. When you're zoomed in, you can see the detail, the materials and stuff. So what we can do now is pretty easily, like I said, let's hop into the render settings here and just make sure we're setting it to Redshift, because what that means now is when we select our camera, it is going to be a Redshift camera by default, or rather, once that actually loads in, you can see we've got a last little Redshift camera there. Let's zero this out. And if any of you guys know me, I like my high focal length, so we can literally turn this to something stupid like 250. Let's make the width and height about 1,500, about 1,500. We can also set our, I think it's view settings here, safe frames. I like to turn this up pretty high so we can see exactly what I'm actually looking at here. And then I'm just going to save that off. Bear in mind also something I noticed recently, when you're saving files with a cache, it will be massive. When I say massive, it's like massive for C4D. It'll be a few gigabytes if you're running a 10-second cache like this. If you're in a situation whereby you bake this cloner and you've got 10 individual cube geometries with their own caches, you will be working with a 30-40 gigabyte file. It will be absolutely insane. So do bear that in mind. Don't go swinging into them caches because they do have an effect. But here we have our pillows. We can zoom in more and sort of pick out a point if there's a bit which looks a little cooler than this, but for now I'm pretty happy with how this looks. So let's take a look at what we're working with. We have our Redshift camera, and if we now activate my little Redshift layout, we can bring up the render engine to see what we're working with. So we can press the start IPR, and that's going to start rendering out our pillows. This is the point where we're going to see whether we have a weird cache with a GPU or whether we need to switch to CPU, although it looks like it should be okay, I'm hoping. Sweet. So of course we've got no lighting right now, so let's quickly drop in just create another camera. We can drop in a dome light, and this is what we're basically going to create most of our light from. This is going to be where the ambient light sort of comes from. So what we can do now is find ourselves a texture, so you can find something that works. For me, I'm going to head to... So I've got this HDRI save that I used last time. It is just a HDRI Studio from Grayscale Gorilla Plus, so if that's what you're using, go for it. I can take out the camera here. You can sort of take a look at what it looks like. Super simple. You can almost create this in Redshift if you wanted to, but it's just creating this sort of like warm light which reflects really nicely. We're using two lighting sources in this instance. So we're using this as ambient, just like what I mean by that is lighting from every direction. So you're not just using one light source. And then we're going to create a Gobo Redshift spotlight to shine a nice window texture onto here. Makes it look a little nicer and adds a little touch to the final render. But for now, you can see what this sort of HDRI actually does as an effect for here. It also means that we get this nice sort of background because the HDRI is not too complicated. If we head into Redshift Dome Light here, the main factor that I used was this saturation. I left the intensity at 1 or lower, but this either desaturates it or has it quite high. Again, actually a pretty cool tip from Redshift. I use this a little bit and I think it's quite cool. It saves you only taking into Photoshop. We'll use some weird nose, sort of like edit the HDRI. So we can have our saturation at something like 50, and I think that looks pretty good. What we're ready to do now is start materializing or shading these pillows a little bit to make them look a little cooler. So what we're going to be doing is creating ourselves a Redshift standard material. Again, in this case, we can drag that straight into the pillows. And we want to make sure we're dropping on the cloner because we're going to be using a factor in a sec, which is going to be important that we put it on the cloner. We can head into our standard material. And I've got a few of my textures just here from what I actually used. So let's see if we drag these in. We need to make sure that we're doing what I did before. Again, I just prefer working this way, but make sure you head to edit, preferences, and then inside your Redshift tab, make sure you're unticking native camera for new scenes. Not native camera for new scenes. Make sure you're unticking node materials presets. That's a new tab in 2023. Don't pay attention to that. And now when we create our material, standard material, you can drag this on and you can see our node and it looks a little different. This is like the standard Redshift workspace, so just bear that in mind. This is better to work with in my opinion. So now what we can do is get our textures, we can drag these in. We can take a look at what we're making. So let's use these. What we need is obviously we've got our normal, rough and diffusion. So if we add diffusion here, let's make sure we're working. It's in auto, but I guess that probably means it's converting it as aces already. If we're working in rough here, we want to make sure that we're setting this to raw and this one also to raw. What that's going to mean is that it's actually interpreting that as sort of like a functional texture rather than a albedo or something like that. We can now make sure that we're dragging these in. So let's take our diffuse texture, head to base, we can put base color. We can grab our roughness here, out color, setting that into our probably reflection roughness. Yep. And then grabbing our normal map, making sure we're activating our bump input here. And before we do that, we need to make sure we get ourselves a bump map and actually plug that normal into here firstly, or rather if it lets me. Make sure we put out the texture and then creating that and putting that to the bump input. You might make the mistake that I just did and rushed and put it straight into the bump input. That is going to make it look terrifying because the normal is going to be all over the place. So just plug this into here and you'll see that you'll get that bump input applied. I'm starting to get a little tired at looking at this super, low detail geometry. So what I'm going to do is, while I set up the scene here, just duplicate this camera and move this a little closer so I can actually see what our cloth is starting to look like. But you can see if we look in, we're getting a nice little bit of detail on these, which looks pretty sick. Another thing that I kind of want to add real quick is just a tiny bit of displacement. So we just create our displacement tab. I'm going to nick the roughness texture here and just grab myself a displacement node, plug that into the texture right here, put that into the displacement, and then make sure, of course, we're heading to our cloner, render, Redshift object, attacking the override option in geometry and then displacement. And we're going to get a very slight bit of displacement, which looks cool when we're, working with gobos and seeing light reflected off this. And you can see that we're looking pretty cool in terms of what our pillows kind of look like at the minute. We're seeing going a nice little bit of detail. Don't focus on the geometry too much right now because we're going to fix that any second with a subdivision surface. One thing that I found really cool was I was really bored of looking at these all being the same color. And I was in a predicament because I was like, well, how am I going to bake off this cloner when it's already cached and then apply different materials, all of this. And there's a great workaround, which means that you don't need to do that. So what we can do is head into our Redshift standard material here. And what it lets you do is actually read some of the values from the cloner. So inside our cloth white diffusion texture here, which is just a basic white sort of texture, seamless, we have a function for a color multiplier here. What we can do is tag that on and then get ourselves I believe it's in, and what we can do is get ourselves color user data and just drag that in here under attribute name. Make sure we're dropping this into geometry ID color and then popping that into this bit here. And we're going to see we're getting loads of crazy values. So what we want to do is get ourselves a ramp and put that in between these values here. So let's drop that in as the general input and then plug that into the color multiplier. And what this is essentially doing now is picking loads of random values from this gradient and applying that as a color. So it's a great way of applying different materials to cloners. There's a few little settings we can do to tweak this. So inside your mapping here, or rather you've got your source and your mapping. Your mapping, I'm guessing, sort of just applies to what direction it's actually applying the randomness of the gradient. And under source, what I've been told is to switch it from auto to alt. I don't know if that actually has much of an effect. You can follow that if you like to. I'm going to do it for now. And then you can start picking what colors you actually want in this gradient. So I just went over to some random color palette site. So I think I just typed in color palette, one of the first one. And I knew that my background was pretty dark. So I didn't want something that was particularly, light. Or I kind of did, but I didn't want something that was going to blend in with the background or look a little weird. So if we just head, explore trending palettes or something, what we can do is right click this, interpolation of all knots, and set that to step. And what that's going to mean is that if you're selecting actual colors, it's going to be one or the other. And essentially, as you move this over, it's going to be the more black ones or white ones that you see, or depending what colors you've got added. And it's going to be typically sort of like sitting in a certain range here. So for me, I chose, the green and blue, or rather yellow and blue in the last one. Here, I'm going to take a look at something a little different. So let's have a look at what we've got. I thought it looked better when there was more variation rather than being, loads of colors of the same one. So let's see what it looks like if we were to grab maybe some... I'm a sucker for pastel colors. So let's have a look if we were to grab maybe... Some of these ones just here. These ones look cool, and it's perfect. So there's 5 colors. So what this lets us do now is, this is the fun bit. We can undock C4D, and this is the one we wanted, right? So we can now head into our ramp and just create a few more of these. And as we create these, we can actually pick out what colors we want. So we've got black here. Of course, we don't want that. So let's grab the eyedropper tool. Well, hold on. We need to make sure we're moving this ever so slightly. Grab the eyedropper tool and let's pick out some of these colors. So we've got some ones like this. We've got a nice little cream there. Let's add one more. And the final red here. Put that in. And now we've got our gradient perfectly in there, and we can actually align some of these to create what we want. So we see these blue bits here are by far taking up the majority. So let's move this down, because I have a feeling that this end of the scale is a little shifted, and it should let us bring a little more variation. Now we're getting a vast majority on this cream here. So we zoom in, we can wean this down a little bit to split these up and bring in maybe a little more of these reds, or however you'd like to do it. Cancel. So let's just quickly, I think that wasn't supposed to be there. Let's move these up. You can bring in some of these blues, some of the darker. Let's see if we can get one of the darker ones there. There are some points where a few of them seem to change at the same time. So again, bear that in mind. Maybe we can shift this up a little bit. And then bring in some of those. It depends what colour is your favourite, really, in this example. We haven't used the subdivision yet, so we can also do is sort of like flick around and see. I think we're getting a little too much of them red pillows in the material there. They're coming in hot. Maybe we can increase this a little bit like that. I'm guessing the more I increase at this point is, so I don't mind too, but you don't want them sort of like, grouping all together, and then you want to create a little bit more of a sense of randomness. But this looks pretty cool. I'm happy with this. So let's take another little look. Let's sort of like have a close one. See if you're happy with the look. I think this looks pretty cool. It's really creating that sort of like pillowy effect. What we can do now is maybe play with the lighting a little bit. So of course we got our Redshift dome light, but let's give this a shot at rotating just a little bit. I think it may actually be upside down, but it doesn't matter. What it's going to do is we're going to see the direction this light is actually shining. So as you rotate around like that, you can see it's coming from the back. This is cool because it creates a little more variation, which is sort of what we're after. When we have more multiple lighting sources, you're on about sort of like making them work together, right? So let's take a look here. This looks quite good. I'm happy with the way this looks, and the background looks cool too. So we can also almost leave this like that. This is all going to make that second spotlight. So let's grab ourselves, not in here, or in there, where we get spotlight. We can create this. So what we're going to use is a quick little tip that I found, where if you create a null and then right click on here, so animation tags and target, we can just in target object, click on that null, and it's now going to move and rotate around that null, which means that we can basically aim for this midpoint no matter what. Let's take it out of our site here, and you can see exactly what I mean. It's basically going to point to that midpoint no matter what. It's going to pin it to it, which looks pretty good. For now, I'm quickly going to deactivate that dome light so we can just see what the spotlight's doing, and you can kind of see what an effect this has. So if we move this back, of course the light's going to get a little weaker, but we can then also extend this to sort of be exactly where we want it to be. And these are our main parameters that are going to have an effect. There's also this little cone angle bit here, which means that you can sort of pick the fall off. And this is something that is only used in Redshift, or native to Redshift, exclusive to Redshift. You have this sort of directional lighting, which is much easier to achieve than it is in Octane, believe me. And what you can see is you get this cool effect. So what we're going to do is under the texture tab, we're going to drop a little something which works. So I have this blinds GSG gobo. Again, you can actually make these really easily, but it's quite literally just a PNG or JPEG, which looks like this. And when you create something like that and then drop it into the texture, you get your gobo shining right on. So we don't want it this small or detailed because we're having quite a close-up shot. So what we can do is increase the cone here to sort of be a little more than we look like. And bear in mind, our HDRI is already a little warm, so we're better off moving with a warmer sort of touch for this light. We can head to our mode here, make sure we're setting that to color and temperature. and dragging down the temperature just ever so slightly so the light looks a little warmer. Here you can obviously up the intensity, but I tend to up the exposure if I'm trying to create something a little more shiny. And if we look in, we're getting that nice gobo look. Pretty well done. We can now activate that dome light again and see how these sort of work together. And we're getting something which looks pretty cool, although I'd say this is probably a little too zoomed in. So let's take a look out here. And you can see that our result is actually starting to take shape a little bit. So this is pretty cool, but of course there's one thing that we haven't done yet, and that is working with our geometry, because it's still a little bit pixely. So what we can do now is finally grab our subdivision surface. The reason I kind of leave this till the last step is because I like to sort of like play around with my simulation, find what looks good. Even if you cached it for some reason, the second you drop this into a subdivision surface, also the materials sometimes change because of that node in Redshift, but they should still look equally as good. What you'll find is it still like lags a little bit. It's just not as easy to go through, but it does have a pretty profound effect on what you're creating. And now you can see that we're approaching a pretty cool result. And when I work with gobos like this, I tend to have the exposure quite high because sunlight isn't really, you know, some sort of like soft ambient light. Usually it shines quite harshly. You get these nice little harsh shadows which sort of sit on. So cool to bear that in mind. I just tweak it up. Tends to look better. Again, just advice. You know, this is art direction after all. And we're getting something which looks fun. It looks like a really cool loop. At this point, again, if you're rendering this off, I'm just going to mention it one last time. Making sure you're in your render settings. You've got your width and height set to whatever you want those to be. You can change the frame range here. So for me, I sort of picked this end bit, but again, you can sort of just switch that up here as you need. When you're inside Redshift here, a lot of this you can keep pretty default, but I had motion blur ticked. Again, just add a little bit of movement. I'm pretty sure I added some RSMB and After Effects later, but that will add a nice little bit of reality to your renders. And then depending on what color space you're working in, you can switch into advanced here and just make sure that under globals, your rendering color space is set to whatever you want that to be. But I haven't actually had to tweak too much in Redshift with that recently because it tone maps everything inside the picture viewer. And just like that, you've essentially created your result. I really like this for the way that I could sort of hone in on different bits and pick up some nice little bits of detail. We're obviously in progressive here, but you get some pretty cool effects, and you can obviously leverage this with the geometry and whatever you actually want to simulate. As you do, you can see what I mean about the creases sort of diffusing as you increase the geometry and actually simulate. So if you were to go back and make them a little more visible, you can see them here. But that's of course totally down to you. For me, I kind of like that look, but it looks pretty sick here. And with that being said, you've pretty much created a nice little looping result. I'm just going to preview what I meant here. But if I set this to 175, and then just for the sake of preview, sort of like drop this out the cloner, untick this, you can see that we're getting something which starts from the middle a little more, sort of looks a little more colliding. That's what I did. But that is just the last point that I wanted to make before I box off the video. So that is how you create some nice looping pillows inside of Redshift and Cinema 4D 2023. I hope you all enjoyed. I thought this was a pretty cool look, so I'm happy I was able to share it with you guys. Again, just like normal, if you have anything you want me to show or learn or appreciate how to do, let me know. I'm always active. Quick little point, we've got an Instagram now, same as the Twitter, so at SeptemberDSGN. I tweeted it yesterday, but just in case you guys didn't see it, it's kind of going to be posting little like reels and loops like this and stuff, more in a consolidated place rather than just at the start of my videos, and yeah, so like follow up there. I'll be posting all sorts of stuff. Twitter as well, we're active all over the place, you know how it is, man. So without any more chat, I'll see you guys very soon in the next video. So thank you all for watching.